Hello, everyone. I'm Alicia Swami, and I am here with my co host, Eric Johnson, and we are exposing mold. Today, we have Dr. D'Angelo from ParaWellness in Colorado. Dr. D'Angelo is a medical doctor specializing in the diagnosis and treatment of parasites. He has over 45 years of experience in medical microbiology and parasitology and conducts research on various aspects of infectious diseases. He is certified in family medicine, integrative medicine, medical microcurrent, clinical aromatherapy, and medical technology. He has also conducted research on the natural treatment of infections with current investigations in parasite eradication. Welcome, Dr. D'Angelo. We're so happy to have you.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here with you today.
Yeah, so the topic of parasites is such a big ordeal because in America, it's not really a primary focus or primary idea that a doctor, say your GP where you can go in and say, "Hey, I think I might have parasites." People kind of look at you crazy, and you can get actually a delusional diagnosis if you focus too much on the possibility of having a parasite. So what's kind of going on in this realm? What are some trends that you're seeing?
Well, one of the problems is that we don't learn about parasites very much in medical school. And then it is not even emphasized during residency and preparation for medical doctoring because, we feel like we're going to leave it to the infectious disease docs and we're going to leave it to the GI docs. And if they think there might be a parasite, then let them figure it out. But the misconception is that there's not a parasite problem here in the United States. And I talked to my doctor friends about that, and they agree. They say, no, there's no parasite problem. We have great public health. We have all kinds of this and that, and we don't have to worry about it. But the fact of the matter is that if you really do good parasite testing, we have a parasite problem here in the country. And that's one reason why I do what I do.
I've got kind of a funny story about that. 20 years ago, I was calling up doctors asking about parasites. I asked all over Lake Tahoe and Reno, and the doctor said, well, there's no parasite problem. In fact, the local laboratories don't even offer a parasite panel. So I called up the laboratories and asked them why. And they said, oh yeah, of course there's a parasite problem, but doctors never order one, so we don't carry it.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. And then the other aspect is this: when I was in training, my training was initially Air Force for medical technology, and then again went back in after Air Force enlisted tour and went into medicine, became a doctor. We had parasite testing done on all of our GIs and even um, their spouses and kids. And often we would find parasites. And this is even stateside, not just overseas. When I was in Vietnam, as an enlisted medical technologist, we had parasites all the time under the microscope. So it's there. Now, I have, when I give talks about parasites to groups and doctors, I say that there's this sign on the border of the United States that says no parasites allowed. Uh, we don't realize that there are the same soils, the same water, and to some extent, some of the same insects that carry parasites. And then all of a sudden, we don't have a parasite problem. I think it can go back to a time when the laboratories were uh, were told by the government that we are not going to pay top dollar for parasite testing. We're going to give you a very small amount. And this happened at a time when I was one of the technologists in a civilian laboratory. And they fired a lot of the high paid technological expertise people because they weren't going to be used for parasite testing and looking for parasites. So they replaced them with mid-level technicians. And I would say that that pretty much stands today, unless there's a real problem. Maybe a pathologist will look at a slide, but that's the exception. When I was practicing family medicine, I would order parasite tests and I would never get a positive, very, very rarely. And I understand what's going on. There's just inexperience with the looking through the scope because they're not really looking for the kinds of parasites that might really be there. And if they do see something, it might be mistaken for some artifact instead of a real parasite. So I never got parasite positive tests when I was in practice, but I knew my patients had them. And some specialized labs would occasionally come up with a parasite. But when I got out of the military, and then when I got finished train my family practice practice and went into sort of a retirement, a friend of mine who took care of cancer patients. He was a practitioner. He used alternative methods. And he came to me and he said, you know, I have to send stool samples to a hospital in Nigeria to get a good parasite test. And they will find the parasites. And sometimes here in the United States, when I do send one to a state lab, they never find the same parasite at all. And I got to thinking, well, what am I going to do in my sort of semi-retirement? I mean, I did this kind of testing in the Air Force and was good at microscope work. So I said, well, let me see if I can set up a little lab and do the tests for you. I mean, to me, that's not even an issue. I'd love to do it. I like working with the microscope and medical microbiology. So he said, okay. And so I started out in 2011 with a microscope in a little lab in my basement in my home. Did all the staining of the slides and collection and what have you, and was finding parasites. And we were taking care of these cancer patients that were having parasite problems. And word of mouth spread from there. And now I get specimens from people all over the country, sometimes out of country, but that's not very often. And there's parasites in the samples. So that's a little bit about how things got started with me doing parasite testing and what I do today.
Wow, thank you for that. In regards to the cancer patients, were they able to resolve their cancer after they treated for parasites?
The ones that I could follow closely enough, they got better. See, the problem here is that the parasite itself rarely causes a direct cancer. They cause inflammation. They tie up immune system stuff. And so that when you get rid of parasites in a cancer patient, or even in another patient who has various inflammatory conditions, then the immune system can work on taking care of the problem instead of fighting a parasite. So in a sense, people get better when they get rid of the parasites, regardless of what their condition is.
Wow, that's really interesting.
I've heard a rumor that some parasites, roundworms, have evolved some kind of diversionary mechanism where they put out enzymes that actually trick the immune system into thinking a virus is present, so that it goes after an imaginary virus and ignores the parasite. Is there any truth to that?
I'm not too sure that I've heard that one. I would say that the idea of a parasite is that it's in a host. Unfortunately, in some cases, it happens to be a human, and they want to survive. And so they will try to hide away from the immune system if they can. Protozoa being a classic example, little tiny one-celled parasite organisms. But the worms, they just curl up in a spot and try to just exist. They are very tough for the immune system to try to get rid of. The immune system will do its job, sending cells that can squirt out various substances to irritate the worm, but they're not going to eat the worm, and the worm usually survives that. So as far as sending out messages to trick the immune system, I think we see that more with some bacteria more than we would ever see it with a parasite, directly a parasite.
Is one of the focal points where these parasites like to hang out the ileocecal valve?
That's one area, but the colon itself, the large intestine, is another area. Many of the parasites start out in the small intestine, and many of your protozoan one-celled organisms are in the small intestine. The worms can be in the small intestine and then drop down into the large intestine, and then eventually maybe expelled from there.
What kind of parasites are you typically finding?
Well, I'm doing bowel movement exam and urine exam. The urine exam is almost 99% negative, but occasionally I do find a parasite in the urinary tract. There is a parasite that can cause a cancer in the bladder, and it's pretty rare for us to see that within the United States. But as far as the stool parasites, I'm looking for protozoa. There's many different kinds. Roundworms, there are 4 or 5 different kinds. The tapeworms, and then what people call flukes, which are more flatworms that are smaller. And those are generally what I'm looking for. I also look for the excess yeast in a stool sample as well. To me, yeast should not be seen hardly at all in a stool sample. But if there's a bunch of yeast coming through, usually that's because the yeast load is so heavy in the intestinal tract that it's just sloughing off as food and stool come through. So I also look for excess yeast.
I've heard a rumor that praziquantel is good for the flukes, the flatworms, and ivermectin is superior for the roundworms. Any truth to that?
I think it depends on what the load is, how much is coming through in the testing. Is it heavy amount of worms, or is it maybe a very, very light infection? I think also it depends on the individual. Sometimes people are getting all of their treatment through an insurance program, and it depends on what insurance might cover. But generally for the worms, you're going to use albendazole. You can use ivermectin. You can use sometimes Alenia, which is nitazoxazide. Those are the ones that generally will catch those. Now, in my practice, I am not licensed to be prescribing anymore. And my treatment of parasites, even when I was in practice, was more holistic. So I will tend to go to a alternative or natural type of treatments for these kinds of conditions.
In terms of the yeast, I'm really curious of that. What do you think is happening in the body where people are having this yeast buildup? Is it from like a parasitic fungal infection?
Well, we all have yeast in the colon. There's no getting around that. And yeast have a very good function because they are very adept at decomposing a material that might otherwise not, we might not get rid of. The problem, I think, is that there becomes an imbalance in the microbiology of the gut, and you have an overload of unwanted bacteria, and you have therefore a displacement of the good guys. The good bacteria often make substances that keep the yeast in check. So I think it starts with dysbiosis of the gut, and then it is increased by nutritional problems where people are taking too many carbohydrates that then the yeast find is a very great source of energy for them, and they multiply and multiply. So I don't think I don't think the parasite problem creates a yeast problem, but I do see parasites and yeast often together coming through in the testing.
Are you familiar with chronic fatigue syndrome?
I am.
A lot of people suspected fungal overgrowth, yeast, and parasites as a cause of their illness. So have you looked for a correlation there?
I have a lot of patients that circle various conditions on the health history form that I receive when I get a test in. Fatigue is a biggie. These people are very fatigued and often have other complicating medical issues to go along with it. Chronic fatigue syndrome, when I was in practice, was more associated with things like chronic bacterial infections. We would find Epstein-Barr virus was probably the number one that came up in the panel of all the different possibilities. And treating Epstein-Barr virus really got these people out of bed and back on their feet. Parasites themselves, I don't find create too much of the intense fatigue that you see with bacterial infections, viral infections, things like that. So although it's one of the things we find, I don't think the parasite problem is the biggie in causing those fatigue issues.
I wonder if you can, or if you've heard of the Dr. Larry Klappau at Stanford story.
No, I haven't.
Well, he's like an associate professor at Stanford who, interestingly enough, is colorblind, which he says gives him like almost magical powers to discern contrast differences under a microscope. And he felt that he had discovered a new species of roundworm, a nematode, which this was back in the 1990s. He provisionally called this Cryptostrongylus pomoni, the hidden lungworm. And his theory was that servicemen traveling back from Vietnam had carried this worm with them, and that the epidemic of chronic fatigue syndrome might be linked to this particular worm. After many years of struggling to get Stanford to have a look at it, the rumor is that he was ultimately validated for a short time, and they gave a provisional name of Varistrongylus Klappaui in his honor to this, and then it kind of disappeared again. And the rumor goes on that what he had done is actually rediscover an existing worm. So his discovery kind of got retracted. But his theory was that this was responsible for the chronic fatigue syndrome and the rise in allergies. So I thought that was a really fascinating theory.
It is. It's a fascinating theory. And we have only discovered a small tip of the total number of types of organisms that we could consider as parasitic or potentially disease causing. That's so true. My training and experience has been mainly in GI tract parasitology. And we get a lot of patients with various complaints, one of which is irritable bowel syndrome. Now, when I was in practice, irritable bowel syndrome, at least as your traditional doctors will do, is they will run a lot of different tests to exclude inflammatory conditions, cancer, stuff like that. And if they can't come up with anything on that kind of testing, then you get a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome. But if what we find is if you take irritable bowel syndrome people and you start looking for bacterial, viral, parasitic, and other causes, I find that parasites are a big cause of irritable bowel syndrome. And one of the biggest parasites in that grouping is something called Blastocystis hominis, which probably was discovered about 100 years ago and has been kind of batted around in research and clinical different areas. They thought it was a fungus, but then they thought it was some kind of a EU bacteria. Then they finally now have classified it as a potential pathogenic protozoa. And we find, I would say this, that about in the course of doing 100 tests on people with various irritable bowel conditions, about what I find is about 78% of them, at least in my lab, have Blastocystis hominis. And this is an organism that is kind of difficult to treat, whether you use prescriptive products or natural products. But it also is one that can cause a lot of issues, diarrhea, cramping, sometimes leaky gut, stuff like that. So yeah, the GI tract is quite a harborer of many different kinds of organisms that could be leading to some of the chronic conditions that you see.
It's notable that the 1988 Holmes chronic fatigue syndrome definition specifies that Blastocystis hominis is a condition which must be excluded in order to get a CFS diagnosis.
Interesting.
Very
Well,
few people do that, though.
yeah, it's well, unfortunately, if I talk to my colleagues, ordinary docs that take care of patients as they come in, and I say Blastocystis hominis, they just look at me like, what? What's that? We don't really have a training on what really is out there underneath the surface of a lot of these conditions. And but I'm happy to say this, that we have a lot of doctors who whose patients came to me and I did a test for them and they took the samples to their doctor and showed them the report. And I think more doctors now are beginning to understand that that we have a big protozoa problem here in this country. We still have occasionally some worms showing up, and that these things can be treated. And it's very satisfying to have somebody who was suffering from various symptoms to suddenly really be happy again. Their guts are calmer and they're feeling better. And so I think we're beginning to get the message out a little bit.
That's awesome.
I can appreciate that this is such a complex field that even if you did receive training in medical school, who could remember all this stuff? It's crazy.
Well, it's true. But, you know, I have books and I have color atlases of parasites, things of that nature. And from time to time, I'm looking at a sample, I see something and it sure looks suspicious, but I'm not sure. And you can go and research it out and find, okay, this is what it looks like. Uh, that's in my field. The doctors that I often get calls from is that I've done a test on their patient. I found certain things and they call me up and say, what do I do about it? And so there's an opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about treatment options. No, we're just not voiced very well in the microbiology world of diseases in medical school, and even as we get out in practice. We think that we can solve everything with a prescription for an antibiotic. And there are a lot of antibiotics prescribed for what we think might be a microbiology problem.
That's interesting. You know, my husband is Indian from India, and he told me growing up that his mom would deworm them yearly. And
Yeah,
they have this protocol where they take castor oil, like loads of it, and then they eat rusum. You know, I'm not providing any medical advice here to anyone listening, but it's just that it's interesting that other cultures are very well versed in this. Like they know that you have to deworm yourself every so
right.
often. And even veterinarians, don't they have a much more sensitive testing methodology to test for worms in like horses and dogs and everything?
Right. They basically they know that these animals pick up these organisms. They pick them up from the same places we visit. I mean, let's face it, you know, the animals drink water from the ground. They're walking and lying on ground and ground surfaces, and the very same ground is what we walk on, lie on, swim in. We're exposed, and yes, they have all the testing that they can do, just like in good parasite labs, you can do that testing on the humans as well. Sure.
Is it then true that if you're sharing a household with pets that you would be more susceptible to getting like a parasitic infection?
I think the general answer would be yes, it's possible. It depends on the pet. Some pets are totally indoors, some are outdoor and indoor. And then you have the larger animals that people keep, you know, the horses and the cow and the pig. And there are certainly uh, parasites associated with those animals. And then people go out and hunt and they kill bear and they kill buffalo and they kill this and that. These animals often have some of the parasites that can infect humans. So yeah, the animal population is a big source of exposure potentially to humans.
How much of a problem is toxoplasmosis?
It's there, it's a problem. We in family medicine, as we would take care of our pregnant ladies, we would want very much for them to, if they, especially if they had cats and litter boxes, not to be involved in cleaning those uh, litter boxes at all, because their exposure would be increased from the potential that the cats would be carrying that particular organism. Um, occasionally, this is out of the area where I look for parasites, but I have occasionally, when I was in practice, had a patient that was talking about something moving around in their eye. And I would send them to the ophthalmologist, and they would run some tests and look at things. And occasionally toxoplasmosis was involved in an eye infection. So it's out there, and screening for that is usually now with a blood test to see if you've been exposed. It doesn't necessarily tell you that you have it right then, but at least people that are negative on the blood test are not going to really be worrying about some kind of a toxoplasma infection.
Is toxoplasmosis mainly caught from cats? Or is
Well,
that literature not really accurate to what we're seeing?
I know by cats because of basically the training that we received, but I'm sure that there are other organisms, other animals, maybe even some birds and things that can carry it. That would be something I would look up to give you a better answer.
And how about mycoplasma infections?
Oh, they're common. They're definitely common. We saw that in medical practice, and we would be looking for those, and especially in patients that were having various lung infections, infections of the respiratory tract in general. We find that. I didn't have much way of treating that except for an antibiotic, but occasionally we would send somebody to an infectious disease who would do the more specialized testing, and they would come up with mycoplasma infection for a particular patient.
So I've heard a rumor that mycoplasma is an intracellular infection, which activates antiviral defenses. So it actually tricks researchers into looking for a virus when it's actually a cell wall deficient bacteria.
Could very well be. I wouldn't have any knowledge of that, but it sounds plausible.
I was a patient of the premier chronic fatigue syndrome specialist, the guy who essentially called the CDC and started this syndrome, Dr. Daniel Peterson. And he became so totally involved in viral infections that that was his specialty, and that was all he treated: Epstein-Barr virus and human herpes virus 6.
Mm-hmm.
And if anybody felt that they had another problem like Lyme disease or parasitic infection, he would send them somewhere else. And so his patients generally went down to Carson City to see Dr. Frank Schallenberger, who is like the local parasite guy. And I kept looking at these patients, seeing if they got any fantastic results, if it was the underlying cause for their Epstein-Barr virus reactivation. And somehow that just didn't really seem to lead anywhere. And I've always wondered about that.
Yeah. Well, again, the parasites, we can have parasites have absolutely no symptoms at all. And since most of the people that send a test kit to me to look at are symptomatic, I often find parasites, but occasionally I'll have someone who just wants to be sure they don't have a parasite. And many times there's maybe a single type of protozoa or something in their system. They don't have any symptoms. So, I think it's possible to not have a problem just because you have a small load of a parasite in your system. And that we do see that from time to time.
So would it be worthwhile to just go ahead and do this annual deworming?
I don't see why not. What I find here in the United States is not very many people have worms, but many people have protozoa. So let me talk a little bit about the protozoa family. They are one-celled organisms. They cannot be seen with the naked eye at all. And when you see them in biopsies of the gut, when the pathologist sees them in gut tissue, they usually line up on the surface of a cell, and they block some of the ability of that cell to get its nutrients and to expel its wastes. So from that standpoint, parasites, the protozoan parasites that are considered harmless, but if there's a lot of them, they can kind of act as a barrier and create a little bit of malabsorption, especially we're talking now about the intestines, the upper intestinal tract, which absorbs your food and everything. So we see that these one-celled organisms can cause malabsorption. We also know that, like blastocystis and some others, they can eat your good bacteria. So again, there's problems with just their presence in the inside lining of the gut. Blastocystis has been found to be inside and between cells, and they've also found it in joint fluid, causing an arthritic inflammation. So these one-celled organisms are more plentiful than the worms are. And then from that point, we try to treat, get rid of the load of protozoan parasites by whatever means is available for them, for that per person. And then occasionally I get a photograph of a worm past when we've treated only for protozoans. So there are people that have worms, and there's no real good way to know that they had a worm except that they passed one. And I know there's tests out there now for DNA, and the DNA tests are great if you have one now, but a DNA test for parasites is sometimes picking up stuff that you may have had a long time ago as well. So I get a lot of protozoans when I'm doing my exams, and occasionally we find evidence of a worm, a larvae, or an egg, a worm egg. And once in a rare while, when you're fishing through the stool, we fish through every stool sample, we'll pull out a worm out of the stool. So yeah, it's just an amazing detective work that parasite exams are.
Wasn't it Dr. Stephen Fry who felt that he had found a novel protozoan in conjunction with chronic fatigue syndrome?
I'm not sure what he found.
Yeah, there was a Fry Labs, and they were talking about, it was all the rage for a short time. That this one specific bacteria looked like a real emergent agent, a culprit for chronic fatigue syndrome. And then that kind of faded away.
Oh, okay.
You have to look that up.
Yeah, that's something else to look up.
What are some common, like other common diseases associated with these protozoa or worm infections that you're seeing?
Well, we see right now in this country, we've had a lot of flooding. And floods are, they bring all of your raw water organisms onto land surfaces. And in some cases, right around your ankles, your waists, because you're wading through all this water. It's in your homes where it's flooded a home. And so we're finding a lot of people with Giardia and Cryptosporidium. And there was a time, probably about 3 years ago, that I was getting positive Crypto and Giardia on almost every West Coast specimen because of all the flooding they were doing. And the floods, they also bring what's on land surfaces into the reservoirs. And so we were finding these parasites, and we found that Cryptosporidium and Giardia are really not killed well at all by um, the various cleaning agents that they try to put in. You're blocking on on what it is, but um, at any rate, what comes through your tap will often have crypto and Giardia in some locations. And therefore, people are exposed. So we were finding a lot of crypto and Giardia. These organisms, the Giardia mainly causes a kind of a malabsorption, but it also causes a really angry gut. And they have a lot of diarrhea problems, mushy, foul-smelling bowel movements. Cryptosporidium does cause diarrhea, and sometimes 10, 15, 20 bowel movements a day. But this organism likes to stay up high in the gut. It likes the area where the bile comes into the small intestine from the gallbladder. And so that organism likes to creep up into the bile duct. And interestingly, the cells that line the bile duct make specialized chemicals that are very good at getting rid of Cryptosporidium. So we are seeing a lot of crypto, and we are seeing a lot of Giardia, especially in areas that are being inundated by a lot of heavy rain and floods.
I have seen in some of the parasite groups, because there's a lot of them on Facebook, and I join them and I like to see what people talk about. And I heard that Giardia is pretty tough to treat. It's very resistant.
Well, the common treatment is Flagyl, which is metronidazole, and probably about 70% treatment. I mean, it's going to get rid of Giardia generally. Sometimes you have to use other antibiotics. But my concern has always been this, that sometimes we don't use high enough a dose of an antibiotic right off the bat, or we don't use it long enough. And for that reason, what I often find with my people is if they take an antibiotic like Flagyl, and they take it for 7 days, maybe 10 days, I like to come back in with some natural products that will maybe get the stragglers. And that's been the problem with parasite treatment, in my view, is that we get rid of the bulk of the parasite problem with a prescription, but then there are stragglers that can kind of set up and maybe start another infection weeks to months later. And I've seen that happen. And I sometimes get that question from patients that had a positive parasite test somewhere else, got an antibiotic treatment, and then 2 or 3 months later, they're back with it again. And they say, what's going on and what can I do? And it's basically, you want to treat it for a longer period of time. Antibiotics are not a great long-term treatment option, but you can tag on to an antibiotic after it's ended with maybe some essential oils or some oregano or some silver or something that will get the stragglers. And I do a 3-month program when I treat patients with a natural program. You've got to just be on top of it and get all of the well, in your case, where you do a lot of microbiology, mycology, the spores, you've got to get rid of the spores. You've got to get rid of the eggs. You've got to get rid of the protozoa that didn't quite get killed and keep them from starting another colony.
Awesome. So then I know that you're not prescribing pharmaceuticals, but are you able to then at least advise if someone would like to do a conjunctive therapy of pharmaceutical and herbal?
Oh, yes. When I do a parasite test, and let's say I have some parasites I found, and I write up a report, the report will include a link to a booklet that I have written. This one is Amazing World of Parasites, How to Treat Them, How to Get Rid of Them. And in there, I have all of the antibiotics that work on the various parasites. So I want them to have that. And a lot of patients want to go and get that prescription from their doctor and try to get rid of it that way. And I think that's a great way to start. But then I also have patients who have been the antibiotic route, or for whatever reason don't want to take one. And then we need to do various natural products. And I have a lot of lists of those that might be helpful.
So either or works then. It's not, I'm always referring to what I'm seeing trend wise. And it seems like the major problem is no one knows what to do. They don't know what dosage, they don't know what drug,
Right.
they don't know where to go. And so it's good
Right.
that you offer that pathway. And then it's, I totally forgot what I was going to say. Oh my gosh, brain fart.
Yeah.
Good Lord. But what I'm seeing trend wise in these groups is, like people don't know what to do, what to take, where to go. And then some people are saying that herbals are not enough and they need like pharmaceuticals. And so how true is that? Are you finding these protozoas or these worms or parasitic infections, are they becoming more resistant to natural things to that you would have to resort to something more chemical based?
Well, that's a great question. I wish I could answer it in a general way. I have to say that I work with each person on a very specific way, and we have to understand what have they tried in the past? What are we trying to do right now? What kind of resources do they want to reach for in treating? And I think that there are failures in the antibiotics that they use and the various antiparasitics, partially because we don't understand, and I say we meaning the general doc population, we don't understand how long we ought to use it and what is the best dosing and interval to give it. And so there are some failures just from not knowing that kind of information. Then in the natural realm, I think that it's a little less likely to have as many we have failures, but it isn't as likely when you use the kinds of things that hit the parasites in multiple different ways all at once. And that's one of the reasons why I use a blend of essential oils, because essential oils have multiple chemicals in each oil. And then you multiply that times different oils in one blend. And these parasites are not going to be able to create a resistance to that type of treatment. But we carry it out for 3 months to get all the stragglers. So I think if you use natural in low dose over a longer period of time, you can get the end point that you want, which is you get rid of the parasite problem that you found. You can also sometimes do both. You can be on an antibiotic and a very low dose of the natural as well. And the two are working together against the parasite problem. They don't interfere with each other. They kind of synergize to the treatment, if you will. And but I have a lot of patients that want to try one and then try the other. And in other words, they might do the antibiotic for the 10 days, then they'll come in on board and do a 3-month of the natural program and try to get it cleaned out that way. So there are a lot of options there. I do like one thing though, the moon cycle. I'll bet if you talk to your Indian people, that they will tell you that parasites are very much attuned to the cycle of the moon. And they are very active at the full moon. And they are. I get a lot of patients that say their main problems come around the full moon. So I treat according to the moon cycle. When I do natural products, I start them when the moon is half full. I carry it through the full moon, and then I carry it past that to maybe when the moon is half waning. So during that interval, the parasites are more likely to take the low doses of what you're trying to give them and more likely to be killed by them. And I think this is very helpful because we don't have to use high doses for a complete long period of time. We use low doses over a shorter period of time, but we're timing it with the way the parasites respond to the moon. And I get questions, well, why do they respond to the moon? Well, if you look at parasites, especially the protozoa, they're 99% water. And water expands. Your tides rise. They get irritable. If I assume if there's a emotion attached to a parasite, I'm giving it one, if they get irritable, they expand. They're more likely to pull in the stuff that you're trying to give them to get rid of them. So that's why what I call my moon cycle treatments. We do 20 days on and 10 days off for 3 cycles, 3 moon cycles.
Well, thank you. You just answered my most burning question because that was the major complaint is about parasites dancing to the light of the full moon.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask another weird question, but I want to debunk this because I've heard some other experts in our realm talk about it. And you're the ultimate expert. So let's ask you, do parasites have a favorite season? Like, are they hatching in fall, like in August, or?
They hatch when they have the best environment for that.
Okay.
So no, I don't see that as happening. I would say that in areas not in our country, but overseas, where a lot of the parasites are dependent upon animal, fish, and other organisms as their host. It depends on the season for those hosts to be more available and be in a position to harbor the parasites. And then, of course, depending on what humans do with those hosts, they might eat the bat or eat this or eat whatever, and then get infected. So once it's in the human body, they are looking for an ideal environment. And when they have the ideal environment and they grow to maturity, they will reproduce. They will start making eggs, or they will make more of themselves, however they're going to reproduce.
Fantastic. Another idea that I'd like to debunk with you is that parasites like to eat metals, and that if you are heavily polluted with metals, then you would have a higher parasitic load. Is that true or not?
I've heard it. I've never seen any good data to support it. I would say this, when we think of metal, we think of heavy metals, of course, I think. But unfortunately, zinc is a metal, and zinc is one of the best things that your immune system can have on hand to help it fight any kind of infection. So I think that taking extra zinc, whatever you're trying to kill or get rid of, is important. I know that some people don't want to take a colloidal silver because they say, well, that's a heavy metal. Yeah, it's a heavy metal. And eventually your body will get rid of it to some extent. But most of the time, you're going to kill the organism. They're not going to live on taking silver into their system.
So zinc and colloidal silver would be good preventative measures for people to take in order to prevent.
I don't like colloidal silver for preventative. I think it's an antibiotic, a very good, high-powered, natural antibiotic. And like any other, you don't want to keep exploding bombs when all you need is a little BB gun. So no, I save that for bona fide infections. But for, what can we do to keep parasites at bay, if you will? You can take some various essential oils, little tiny dabs by mouth. Some people do oregano. I find that to be very caustic to the tongue and mucous membranes, unless you put it in a capsule. We take something called ImmuGuard, which is something we make up that has about 7 or 8 or 9 essential oils in it. Just a little dab on the tongue. I've had people going to overseas to various places, and they take a bottle with them to try to, keep the bacteria load and the parasite load from being a problem. Iodine is another anti-parasitic, but you have to be careful because you don't want to overload the thyroid. So sometimes small amounts of iodine. Some people have taken, trying to think of the name of it, I can't think of it right now, but there are products out there that supposedly will kind of keep the parasites at bay.
Is it Lugol's?
Lugol's iodine, you can take
Oh.
Lugol's.
Oh.
Iosol, IOSOL is another iodine that's very good. It's in drops. Grapefruit seed extract is what I was thinking of. If you can get real grapefruit seed extract and not the stuff that's been doctored and adulterated, that's been used overseas when people go overseas to not get parasites when they're in rural overseas areas. Yeah.
Would grapefruit juice work the same as grapefruit
No.
seed? Oh,
No.
okay. Two different components. Okay. What about biofilm? Are parasites protected by biofilms?
They can be. The body does biofilm as a defense mechanism. It basically wants to wrap a pathogen in something that the immune system doesn't have to keep worrying about. I actually had a photograph sent to me of a patient that passed a worm completely encapsulated in a biofilm. It was really something to see. But the oils that I use, essential oils, are basically biofilm disruptors. So when we do our natural treatment over the 3 months, I'm not worried about them not getting the biofilm problem. They'll take the biofilm down and then get the parasites that might be trapped in the biofilm.
That's interesting that you describe it as the body's like protective response, because what seems to be talked about is that it's the offending organism's protective response. Like that organism is building its own shield, not necessarily it's the body trying to protect, from these organisms. So it's interesting that you say it's opposite.
Well, I think you can say it's a combination of things, but at the same time, a lot of these biofilms are mucus laden as well. And of course, the body makes this glycoprotein mucus for purposes of encapsulating stuff that the body doesn't want to deal with. Then you dehydrate that, and you can get a more crystalline type of film So I really kind of think it's a combination of things, but that the body ultimately is trying to encapsulate a problem so it doesn't have to deal with it. So it allows that to happen, but it also benefits from it happening. If you kind of see my gist there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I have one last question and then we won't take any more of your time. I know we're beyond the hour, but I feel like I want to
Okay.
ask you so many questions. Like we have
Yeah.
you here. Um, so what, just from your inspection point of view and your investigative skills and looking into parasites, like what percentage of the population you think are carrying parasites, worms, protozoa?
Well, I would say a high percentage. And that's partly my bias because I see people that are worried about parasites or have them or have symptoms that are very much indicative of a possible parasite problem. But in the when we were doing surveillance over in Vietnam, when I was doing the parasite lab over there, uh, after I enlisted and was trained as a medical technologist, we did surveillance of GIs coming into the country to fight to see what was their parasite load. These are people that basically are from the States and really have not been fighting in some other locale. And many of them had parasites, which was surprising to me at that time. I just had a high school degree and all the training of a medical technologist, and I was thinking, wow, we have a lot of people with parasites, mainly protozoan, I might say, not worms. And then when the GIs would come in from the field, they were sick, whatever, they would run stool tests on GIs, and they had the same parasites that the Vietnamese population had in many cases. So I think, at least in this country, for an ordinary person who has no symptoms, parasite load is there but very low. There may be a few of what the CDC calls benign parasites, and I think that's fine. But I also have a bone to pick with CDC that if you have a lot of benign parasites, you can have an irritation, you can have symptoms, and then you can sometimes have a mix of benign and pathogenic. And if you only see the benign, you don't treat them, and then they have more problems. So uh, it's there. There are parasites there.
Oh, I
Are you
did think of one more question.
Yeah,
Do you see an inexplicable drop in body temperature in association with parasites of about 1 to 2 degrees?
I haven't looked at it.
Oh,
I wish I could tell you an answer. I've not looked at that. Um, no, as far as temperature and parasites are concerned, I am drawn more to the malarial parasite, where the body temperature goes way up as an attempt to fight it. And that's actually a clue to the fact that a person might have malarial type of parasite. But other than that, I'm not sure about the body lowering of the temperature.
very interesting? And then, all right, I do have one more question. I swear, I promise you. We'll
Okay,
let you go.
whatever works.
Okay, because I know we want to be very respectful of your schedule. I know you're very busy as well. Are parasites transferred from mother to baby?
The answer is yes, but I can't give you the possibility of that.
Hmm.
Um, I would have to do the research to refresh where that came from, but it is potentially possible. Um, and it's probably more the worm family than it is the protozoan family. because worms can burrow. But you know, the transmission of person to person is a problem. If a person has, let's say, we get a lot of people with Giardia and Cryptosporidium. These are diarrhea-producing organisms. They can be found for a very short period of time on the skin around the anal opening. Sometimes can be for short periods of time found on the hands after wiping. You know, that's why you got to wash your hands after you have a bowel movement or urinate. And the reason is that these organisms are potentially transmissible. Who are you going to transmit it to? Probably not someone else. We often touch our mouth or whatever, and we get it right back in again. But you know, if you have good hygiene among family members, you very rarely have a transmission problem. But if you don't have good hygiene, or maybe it's forgetful at times, you may have a transmission from one person to one or two of the other family members. And I've done whole families where a person, they all want to be tested at the same time. And I'll find the one that has all the symptoms has the main parasite problem. And maybe one other or two others have a very low grade of the same parasite, and then others that don't have any. So again, transmission is a problem. They did a study in Los Angeles one time, public health study, where they went into restaurants, got the workers, and took scrapings from under their fingernails and found that there were bowel movement under fingernails, fecal material. So can you transmit from fecal material under a fingernail? Unfortunately, yes. So hygiene is the best prevention for parasites that you
And
can.
don't forget the ice machines. They found in restaurants that
Yes,
the fecal bacteria was always winding up in the ice machines.
yeah, ice machines. And ice machines are another source of protozoa, especially Giardia and Cryptosporidium, because you can't kill them with the various chemicals that the public health systems use to kill the germs in our water supply that we use as tap water. And some of these ice making companies are not local in the city. They may be out in rural areas, and they are using water perhaps from areas that are not as where the water is too raw, I would say. That's another potential possibility. Yeah, there's a lot out there that puts the United States population at some risk, and the doctors themselves, they don't see that. They don't think about that. And I warn the doctors when, like in Texas, they had all these rains came through a while back and flooded South Texas big time. And I have some doctors down there that send me parasite testing from on their patients. And I let them know, hey, with all this flooding going on, be aware that the incidence of Cryptosporidium, Giardia, and other parasites will go up because of their potential exposure to these things with the flooding, just to make them more aware. So awareness is where we have some things that we have to work on in terms of parasites.
So you're saying order the beer instead of the water at a restaurant?
Absolutely.
All right, mental
Yeah.
note. Now, so we're into mold and mold illness and how environments can cause illness. I don't know if you're tracking this in your questionnaires, but are you seeing an association between environmental related diseases and positive parasite tests?
I don't know that I'm tracking it in terms of a questionnaire, but I do get information by email from patients who ask questions about where they are and what's going on in their environment. And then would that make them more susceptible to parasites? And most of the time it has to do with problems with land where they have they're resurfacing areas where there's mud and other potential areas where there's been a lot of animal activity. And I get questions about can I, play in the water of a particular lake or river? How worried should I be about being exposed and things of that nature? So environment is a biggie, and I think we have to think about it. Another example is when I have a list in this little booklet that people download about how to take care of these parasites. I say, if you're a fisherman, you're exposed. Why are you exposed? You're handling the line, which is wet. You're pulling up a fish and he's flapping around. You're getting the water on skin. You've got to be thinking about that. Another environmental situation is, where is your food coming from? An example is about 4 or 5 years ago, I was seeing a particular parasite that causes diarrhea. And it's, I can't think of the name right off the hand, but it was one that I was seeing a lot of. And this was unusual. I don't see this hardly ever at all. And the CDC also was picking this up in questions from labs. And it turned out that it was coming off of leafy produce that was being grown in Central America next to a huge farm that had cattle grazing. And the water and rain would wash that fecal material into the farmland. And it was on the plants. So I tell people, please, we don't know where your produce is coming from. It's not coming from just the grocery store, folks. It's coming from who knows where. And wash it, rinse it. If you're really worried about it, put some vinegar in water and let your produce stand in that for a little, 10, 15 minutes, then rinse it off and put it up. Because again, we are being potentially exposed due to the environment in which the food is being grown, stored, transported. So that's another example of where environment and potential parasite exposure kind of connect.
Yeah, we recently, well, not recently, I think a year ago, we had a conversation with a EPA microbiologist, and he sounded the alarm on the sewage sludge that we are using from, I guess, our own sewage. And they are processing that, and they're putting it on every piece of public land there is across America. And he said it's an improper way of processing, so that pathogens and everything else is still existing in this sewage sludge. And he was later fired, but he then went back and sued, and to which the judge said he was wrongfully terminated. So I don't know if you heard that one. I feel like you might be interested in listening to that episode just for your own knowledge, but we were like freaked out by that. And then that's when, and he told us even before the whole COVID vaccine thing, where he said, watch, you're going to start seeing COVID coming up in sewage. And all of a sudden, months later, we started seeing these articles about COVID being found in our sewage. And
Right.
so when you think like, why are we using this and then spraying it everywhere? It's like, it's
Exactly.
a little maniacal.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to have fecal material placed anywhere other than in the sewer and leave it to be processed by the people that do a good, safe processing of that kind of waste, because it's not it's a danger. It is definitely a danger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Dr. D'Angelo. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. If anyone wanted to order a test or maybe consult with you, how would they go ahead and do that? Where can they find you?
Probably the best way would be to go online and go to ParaWellness Research, ParaWellness research.com, and read the homepage and look at what is involved. And if they so wish to, they can order it. I don't require a doctor's ordering. And I always work with the patient and secondary with the practitioner or doctor. But my contract is always with the person wanting to be tested.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for your work. And we hope that your work will survive beyond you and will forever be around because, like you said, until we're able to, come up with better testing methods, I feel like your method right now is probably the strongest. What we have out there is you're really going under the microscope to examine what's going on. So
Thank you. Well, it's been a great opportunity, and I've actually learned a lot talking with you and the gentleman. So it's been good. So thank you.
awesome. Yeah. Eric is a really cool guy. He's got a lot of random knowledge. So if you two
Yeah.
ever want to connect, I'll connect you two. You guys can chat it up.
Okay.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. Thank you.